Welcome to the Berlin Family Lectures, in which Professor Danielle Allen is speaking on the topic, Democracy in the Time of the Coronavirus. Tonight is her third lecture, Federalism is an Asset. I am Jonathan Lear, the Roman Family Director of the Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society at the University of Chicago. And Danielle and I were close colleagues at the Committee on Social Thought when she was on the faculty here. In her previous lecture, Danielle said that her training in classics, especially the political thought of Plato and Aristotle, remains a help to her as she thinks through the issues challenging us in these sickening times. And her remark was more than a bromide about the humanities. Plato and Aristotle's insights into the meaning of political community run deep, and agree or not, there is much that remains to be learned for our times. But there is a point Danielle did not mention that I want to bring up because I think, once seen, it provides a thread that unites all of Danielle's writings, her teaching, research, her public service, and foundation work. One cannot engage with the political thought of Plato and Aristotle without coming to grips with the fact that both were critics of democracy. Plato in particular was rather scathing. He thought that democracies would inevitably elect flatterers and bullies, politicians who played to the worst instincts in people, politicians who did not tell the truth, who themselves were self-deceived, and who, as we might now put it, used advertising techniques rather than thoughtful argument. It did not matter, Plato thought, which side one was on, to use our terms left and right. For him, in a democracy, all sides would produce inferior leaders. And there's also this still, I think, undigestible fact that the first truly great philosopher in the Western tradition, Socrates, was put to death by a democratic vote of Athenian citizens. Plato and his political and ethical writings emerged from that trauma. When I was a young man, it was fashionable to dismiss Plato's anti-democratic writings as the rantings of an ancient enemy of open society. But as the decades have passed, his critique has come to seem more salient, and it is a critique that needs to be answered. It seems to me that one can view Danielle Allen's career as a lifelong effort to prove Plato and Aristotle wrong when it comes to democracy. Danielle is a lover of democracy. Her public life has been spent arguing for it, living it, teaching it, encouraging others to join in her communal democratic life. Indeed, if I understand her correctly, the only way to become a philosopher, that is a lover of wisdom, is to be a lover of democracy. For true wisdom is only reached through communal conversations and debates. It arrives from free speech open to all citizens. Danielle understands that if one really wants to refute Plato and Aristotle, one needs good arguments, but one also needs to set an example. One needs to live democracy and encourage all one's fellow citizens to live it too. One can see this not only in her foundation work, her volunteer teaching, her many engagements in programs of social justice, but also in her style of writing. For example, her book, Our Declaration, is not simply a book about the Declaration of Independence. It is itself a declaration. It is her declaration, an exhortation that we, the readers, should become active and do what it takes to make this declaration our declaration as well. And I'm reminded of Lincoln's exhortation in the Gettysburg Address, that his audience should not focus its attention on dedicating a cemetery that needed no further dedication. Rather, we should dedicate ourselves to the nation's founding ideals of liberty and equality. And Danielle's ambition, as I understand her, is to reanimate democracy in America in such a way that she can turn to the ghosts of Plato and Aristotle and say simply, "We refute you thus." As we welcome Danielle back to our company for this third Berlin Family Lecture, I hope you will listen to her and see her in two ways. First, there will be her thoughts on federalism and her policy proposals, the content of her talk. But second, there is Danielle as an exemplar of a democratic citizen, putting forth her ideas in public space for open debate, and thereby encouraging us all to do something similar. Now, we are not in a familiar auditorium, but I am confident you will all join me in extending a warm Zoom welcome to Danielle Allen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was an extraordinary introduction, and it is such a privilege to be read and watched and interpreted by you. I can't remember, I think, any other introduction that has so thoroughly captured what does animate me and what my ambitions are. So thank you. That was unparalleled. And your introduction also reminds me that I think the first time I tried to really mine my thinking about Plato and Aristotle for thinking about the present problems of democracy came in 2001, shortly after September 11th. And I gave a lecture in Los Angeles to University of Chicago alumni that focused on the knowledge problem of democracies. And the entire paper, the purpose of it was to refute Plato, exactly as you just indicated, his argument that democracies could never know enough to govern themselves well. And I wanted to lay out a case for what it would take for democracies to know enough to govern themselves well. And that lecture amongst University of Chicago alumni was the only time in my career where people nearly came to blows in the audience over my argument. I think that would be impossible outside of the world of University of Chicago, where both Plato and democracy are fighting words in effect, where people care so passionately about getting the answers right that the work done there is unmatched. So I'm grateful to you for your colleagueship when we were both at the University of Chicago, for your incredibly generous words, but also for having recovered that memory for me. So it is a beginning to the conversation that we're having tonight. So thank you. Federalism is an asset. If we remember back to March, it feels like lifetimes ago, but not that long. The narrative in the press was about chaos as states and hospitals competed for rare supplies. The narrative was about the absence of a national testing strategy and how states were going their own way. I think there was a general sense of lack of a way, lack of a coherent national strategy. The Trump administration responded to that narrative in the press by making its own case that indeed it had a strategy of decentralization, and even more importantly, federalism. And the White House is right. Federalism is an asset. In other parts of the world, the pandemic has been most easily controlled in population units smaller in scale than a massive nation state, such as the US. China controlled the pandemic by locking down Wuhan specifically. Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Iceland, New Zealand, and Australia were able to draw on properties of their island status and smaller populations to fend off the virus. By early April, Iceland, with a population of just over 300,000, had tested 10% of its population. The small town of Vo, Italy, had tested everybody. The network properties of virus transmission mean that controls aligned to the existing network structure of social life do perform better than those disconnected from those structures. A case study is the contrast between Singapore, which failed to control the virus within its migrant community, and South Korea, which moved swiftly at key points to control spread within specific communities and social networks. The best way of aligning COVID-19 response to the properties of disease transmission is to lodge authority for key public health decisions at the level of state and local authorities, who are best positioned to understand and respond to the dynamics of community spread. At the same time, though, those state and local authorities need conditions for success. The island nations combine an ability to make policy at levels closely tied to social network structures with the ability to achieve full coordination of a national economy. Because of our tiered structure, public health authorities at the state and local level have been without one of the tools they need, economic coordination at the national level. They do need leadership and support from the upper tier of the federal government. So our tiered structure is valuable because it modularizes our society and makes it possible to deploy policy programs on smaller scales. Contact tracing, for example, and questions of privacy are a clear example of the benefits of a tiered federal system. A localized system of tracing and testing offers better privacy and civil liberties protections. That said, it does also require support from federal legislation and agencies to oversee a program. If contact tracing programs that depend on highly sensitive data are anchored at the local level, rather than flowing into nationally centralized databases, they don't pose the same degree of threat to civil liberties. So the tiering of our federal structure and situating a policy authority at lower levels can provide resilience and protection. But success, as we'll see, requires support from the upper tiers of the system. Indeed, to see the value of federalism for the crisis at hand is not necessarily to concur that the White House has successfully led a federalist strategy. To evaluate that question, we have to look more deeply into federalism itself, its history, and its key principles. The problem we faced in March and April was actually very similar to that in the period between the American Revolution and the Constitutional Convention, but in reverse. Then the national government needed revenue to handle war debts and ongoing obligations for which it had responsibility. Yet it had no authority to secure those revenues from the states. It was at the mercy of states' autonomous decisions about whether or not to hand over revenue to the federal government. Fully masters of their own revenue, states simultaneously set up tariffs among themselves, and the system of interstate commerce was breaking down. The fundamental purpose of the drafting of the US Constitution was to achieve an alignment of the responsibilities and authorities for federal and state governments such that the system as a whole could function to deliver safety and happiness to the people. This is a point made in Federalist 43. In invoking the safety and happiness of the people, Federalist 43 was tying the Constitution back to the Declaration of Independence, that key promise that political institutions deliver safety and happiness. That phrase was the early American translation, as I suggested in my first lecture, of the Roman phrase, salus populi suprema lex esto, let the health of the people be the supreme law. The entire purpose of our constitutional structure is to deliver salus populi. In what follows, I'm going to take a close look at American federalism, outlining key elements of the Federalist framework developed both at the time of the writing of the Constitution and during a period of 20th century renovation. I'll lay out the value of a truly Federalist response to our own moment, and offer a brief evaluation of whether the White House has come to achieve a genuinely Federalist strategy. As you all know well, tomes have been written on US federalism, starting with the Federalist Papers, that set of opinion pieces in newspapers by Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay. Many of the key features of federalism have been much debated, but 5 are particularly important for understanding our current moment. The drafters of the Constitution self-consciously tiered responsibilities and authorities, recognizing that different kinds of functionality should be handled either nationally and centrally, or at a more local level, closer to the diversity of facts on the ground. They thought explicitly about the joints connecting the whole federal system and charged the national government with maintenance of harmony and proper intercourse among the states. Finally, they consider the legislative branch, not the executive branch, to be the first branch of government. While power has swung to the executive branch over the course of our history, and particularly over the course of the 20th century, from the Great Depression onward, it is nonetheless the case that the structure of our Constitution and federal system depend in important ways on the primacy of the legislature. Modernized federalism, a child of 20th century jurisprudence, introduces 2 additional key elements of particular relevance to us now. There's the role of the US government in guaranteeing equal protection of the laws for all, thereby requiring all states to adhere to protection of constitutional rights. And then there's the recognition that in contexts of demographic diversity, devolution of power, where possible, provides an avenue to empowering minority subpopulations. I'm going to take each of these features in turn. So we'll start with tiered responsibilities and authorities. It's widely recognized that the drafters of the Constitution desired a framework for the exercise of power that prevents its abuse. And a key feature of that design was, of course, separation of powers. Conventionally, they focus on the division of power among legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and the assignment of these separable powers to different office holders. You typically take both separation of powers and checks and balances to name the structure of operations among the 3 branches of government. Yet the drafters of the Constitution actually extended the separation of powers approach even beyond the specific division among legislative, executive, and judicial powers. They also recognize that different substantive domains of functionality work as distinct channels of power. So they separated substantive domains in order to drive the exercise of power into separable channels. The assignment of some substantive powers to the federal government and some to state governments therefore also functioned to separate powers for the sake of reining in likely abuses. Hamilton sketched this point in broad strokes in Federalist number 17. So here's a long passage. It may be said that the new Constitution would tend to render the government of the Union too powerful and to enable it to absorb those residuary authorities which it might be judged proper to leave with the states for local purposes. Allowing the utmost latitude to the love of power which any reasonable man can require, I confess I am at a loss to discover what temptation the persons entrusted with the administration of the general government could ever feel to divest the states of the authorities of that description. The regulation of the mere domestic police of a state appears to me to hold out slender allurements to ambition. Commerce, finance, negotiation, and war seem to comprehend all the objects which have charms for minds governed by that passion, and all the powers necessary to those objects ought, in the first instance, to be lodged in the national depository. The administration of private justice between the citizens of the same state, the supervision of agriculture and other concerns of a similar nature, all those things, in short, which are proper to be provided for by local legislation, can never be desirable cares of a general jurisdiction. It is therefore improbable that there should exist a disposition in the federal councils to usurp the powers with which they are connected, because the attempt to exercise those powers would be as troublesome as it would be nugatory, and the possession of them for that reason would contribute nothing to the dignity, to the importance, or to the splendor of the national government. The core of Hamilton's argument was that the drafters of the Constitution had taken care to deposit with the federal government those substantive domains of policy most likely to attract the attention of hungry power seekers. The result of that choice of depository was that fewer areas of policy would even be drawn into the worst competitions for power than would occur in a fully centralized regime. The relevant powers of the federal government would be the substantive domains of commerce, finance, negotiation, and war. These powers would be fiercely contended, fought for through difficult and bruising competitions. But other substantive domains would be therefore implicitly left to the states and exempt from the complexity of those difficult struggles for power. The underlying concept of tiered functionality and responsibility was formalized in the 10th Amendment, which reads, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." On the basis of this 10th Amendment, most public health authorities lie with state governments. That said, to the degree that public health is connected to matters of national security or the regulation of external borders, federal authorities are relevant. While states have authority over internal borders, the Federal Interstate Commerce Authority does also give the government, the federal government that is, some authority over internal borders. In short, public health law in America is complex because authority is divided among federal, state, and local governments, necessitating a high level of coordination. As a public health official in Illinois put it to me recently, if you've seen one state public health system, you've seen one state public health system. To use our federal structure effectively, this intricacy needs to be visible to us and understood as legitimate. Hence the importance of sketching it out and reviewing its original justifications. A second key feature of federalism is the role of the national government in harmonizing the activities of the states. In Federalist 41, Madison took up this subject of tiered assignment of responsibility and provided the following enumeration of the powers conferred on the government of the Union: security against foreign danger, regulation of the intercourse with foreign nations, maintenance of harmony and proper intercourse among the states. The disharmony among the states that followed the introduction of the Articles of Confederation and that ultimately gave rise to the Constitutional Convention lie behind the desire expressed in the third item on the list. Although the delegates to the Continental Congress began work on the Articles of Confederation simultaneously to drafting the Declaration of Independence in the summer of 1776, They weren't able to achieve ratification until March of 1781, 5 years later, so much of the war having passed in between. By the time the articles were ratified, the document's authority was tenuous, with voices already raised for a revision. The challenges of financing the Revolutionary War had quickly brought a number of economic and political issues to a head and surfaced the weaknesses of the institutional design of the Articles. The core problem was that the Articles of Confederation gave the federal government no independent source of revenue. Congress and Washington, at the head of the Army, had to rely on voluntary contributions from the states. Yet states, too, were ineffective in raising taxes and inconsistent in paying their contributions to the Confederation. The government's basic ability to pay and feed its army to raise supplies for the war effort was in question throughout the war. Moreover, trade deficits generated a shortage of specie, of gold and silver, which spurred states to increase their printing of paper money and drove runaway inflation. The amount of flour that 100 pounds of paper currency could buy dropped from 140 hundredweight, the measurement of the time, to less than a single hundredweight over that period of 5 years. The economic challenges affected the war effort and political stability, of course, but also commercial activity and the prospect of domestic prosperity. As Silas Deane wrote to James Wilson in 1780, Congress's, quote, chronic inability to put its financial affairs in order had shaken all faith in the integrity and character of America. Like Alexander Hamilton, Scots-American James Wilson was very concerned by the state of affairs. Well-read in Scottish political economy, Wilson sought to help the young country develop a banking system to secure public credit. Shortly after the loss of Charleston, South Carolina to the British in May 1780, Wilson, Thomas Willing, and Robert Morris rolled out a plan for the Bank of Pennsylvania. In July, the bank opened its doors, almost fully subscribed, with both subscribers and the bank committing that all funds taken in by the bank would support the war effort. The bank was relevant not merely as a provider of capital. Its backers saw it as an instrument for improving fiscal policy generally. In the Pennsylvania Assembly in November of 1780, Wilson argued for the introduction of 3 taxes: a tax on real and personal estates, an import tax, and an excise tax. These, Wilson argued, would enable Pennsylvania to pay its war debt, and now there was a bank that could put such revenue to work in the economy. The Assembly rejected Wilson's arguments, but they offer a window into early views about how to secure the public revenue necessary to stabilize the new government with methods compatible with popular sovereignty. Immediately upon the heels of erecting the Bank of Pennsylvania, Wilson, Morris, Hamilton, and others turned toward the building of the Bank of North America. Robert Morris, the superintendent of finance for the US, submitted a plan in 1781, and Congress approved it quickly, chartering the bank formally in December, a few months after the short-lived Bank of Pennsylvania had closed. Aiming to shore up the finances of the 13-state confederation, leading politicians moved quickly to link up the bank and the tax system in the states. The effort to shore up national finances with the national bank and its banknotes introduced further stresses. The benefits accrued largely to the merchant class on the coasts, as coastal merchants sought repayment of debts from farmers who themselves still had insufficient access to currency. The economic challenges polarized the political community. The more radical Western farmers became powerful antagonists of the bank, in a set of dynamics that would lead eventually to the paper money riot in New Hampshire in 1786 and to Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786 and 1787. In addition, the efforts of each state to raise funds on its own behalf as part of the effort to deal with war debt was leading to a tariff war among them. The provisions of the Articles of Confederation intended to forestall such a thing were giving way to the press of necessity. The congressional record for January through March 1783, just before the signing of the Paris Treaty, reveals a set of extraordinary debates about the finances of the new nation and their great instability. As members of Congress tried to find revenue and to determine which creditors to pay, soldiers or the states that had incurred expenses for the war, their arguments previewed those that would define the Constitutional Convention 4 years later. How could states that were geographically more distant from Congress and thus had not been able to tap into the public coffers during the war receive fair recompense? And of course, none could be compensated if none had contributed. So that generated another set of questions. How should the responsibility to fill the national purse be allocated? Should there be an assessment of the value of the land in each state as a way of measuring what they should contribute? Should their populations be counted? If so, how should enslaved people be treated? What authority did the national government have anyway to draw tax revenue from the states? By the summer of 1785, Congress was not functioning effectively. Frequently, it had too few delegates for a quorum, and the debates continued over the financial difficulties. After the 1783 taxation debates, matters had grown still trickier. The Federalists, recognizing the linkages among war debt, the challenges of political economy, and their institutional structure, kept the issue of amending the Articles of Confederation on the agenda. The possibility was mooted in Congress in early 1783. But by September 1783, the Anti-Federalists had gained the upper hand and the issue was tabled. As that year came to a close, Federalist frustration with the turn of public opinion against them led to an intensified campaign of pamphlets, letters, and newspaper articles calling for a national bank and a constitutional convention. Their anti-Federalist adversaries also intensified the battle. In March 1785, for instance, radicals secured passage in the Pennsylvania Assembly of a law authorizing issuance of bills of credit to be printed on paper. And at this news, the Bank of North America responded that it was not inclined to receive such irresponsible paper. The bank's adversaries began advocating revocation of its charter. When the bank's charter was indeed revoked, it upended public confidence in the bank and its near-term viability. This in turn precipitated an agreement among 9 states to meet in Annapolis in September of 1786 to debate the question of whether to hold a constitutional convention. The result, of course, was the convention itself and then the US Constitution. The document that organizes the powers of the US government was fundamentally motivated by a need to resolve disharmony among the states, particularly as it was emanating from a tariff war and financial and fiscal failures. I rehearse all of this history because this problem of disharmony is so similar to the problem that we've experienced over the course of this winter. After the pandemic hit, it was not long before we saw states competing for supplies and personnel necessary to meet the exigencies of the moment. It was not long before municipal and state budgets began to teeter and teeter still on the brink of failure. The same problems of coordination that plagued the new republic in the years between the Revolution and the Constitutional Convention are plaguing us now. The economic impacts of COVID-19 can be usefully partitioned into 2 categories: composition effects and scale effects. Composition effects refer to collapses in the demand for certain goods and services, even as demand for others is sharply rising. We don't right now want restaurants or movie theaters, but we do want tests, for example, of all kinds, diagnostic tests, antibody tests. We want PPE, we want other kinds of medical equipment. That's a composition change for the economy. Scale effects refer to aggregate size of the economy with respect to employment and output. These different categories of impact require different policy responses. Redeployment at scale to deal with composition effects, and social support and financing to deal with scale effects. However, our overriding goal from the beginning should have been clear. We needed to maximize the speed and aggressiveness of compositional transitions in the economy in order to minimize the necessity of scaling down. A system in which states were and still are competitors for scarce emergency goods on an unusually compressed timescale runs the risk of failing to deliver the compositional shifts necessary to fight a pandemic successfully. Such a system also runs the risk of fracturing the federal structure in a manner similar to a tariff war. Occasioned by the sudden pandemic, these problems then gave the federal government 2 jobs to do in order to maintain harmony and proper intercourse among the states. The first, to temporarily control the supply chain for the resources needed to fight the pandemic, and the second, to backstop state and local government fiscal health, the very issue currently being debated in Congress. On both fronts, the federal government was responsible, in essence, for enabling the federal system as a whole to activate and deploy surge capacity efficiently across the whole of the national system. Our standing military, for instance, provides surge capacity needed for national defense, such that it can be activated to any state that needs it, even though states also have their own contingents of National Guard reserves. While the states individually maintain some surge capacity, the efficacy of national surge capacity depends on our ability to tap into resources across states in a coordinated fashion in order to allocate resources to where they are most needed and to fill gaps in those resources with federal backstops. A second important element of federalism, or rather third, I apologize, of federalism to focus on is the primacy of the legislature. So the issues of the supply chain and fiscal solvency of our system as a whole were of central concern. And the Federalist structure is designed specifically to help on those two fronts. But the question of whose job it is to meet those responsibilities requires its own attention. Recognition of these key responsibilities of the federal government doesn't mean that all responsibility and authority lies with the president. A third element of our federalist system that's salient in this crisis, though often overlooked, is the primacy of the legislative branch. In popular understanding, the executive has become the first branch. This is perhaps best captured in an Annenberg poll about civic understanding. The poll reports that only 26% of Americans can name the branches of government. But then, what's more important from my point of view is the poll lists those branches in the following order: executive, judicial, and legislative. In providing that list, the poll itself represents a fundamental failure of civic knowledge. The executive isn't the first branch, nor, for that matter, another common misconception, were the three branches of government understood by the founders as co-equal. Congress is described in Article 1 of the Constitution for a reason. It comes first. The exercise of power originates with the expression of a will or intention. Congress expresses the will of the people. Only after the will is expressed can there be execution of the desired action. It's for this reason that the executive branch, described in Article 2, comes second as the second branch. The judiciary comes third as a necessary mediator for addressing conflicts between the first and second branches. In the Federalist Papers, Madison, Jay, and Hamilton do use the vocabulary of co-equal, but not to refer to the three branches of government. They use the language of co-equal institutions to refer to the taxing powers of the states and of the national government. They also describe the House and the Senate, the two houses of Congress, as co-equal, but never do they describe the three branches as co-equal. So why does the degree of Congress's power matter to our collective well-being? Answering this requires revisiting the basics of the institutional design of our democracy. Two key ideas have made the American system stable. The first is that representation can be used to build a democratic republic at scale. The second is that durable democratic republics require minority protecting mechanisms to glue electoral majorities and minorities together. The combination of popular representation, which gives power to electoral majorities, and minority protecting mechanisms, which are a counterweight to that majority power, stabilizes our system. Each taken on its own would drive our politics into divisive conflict. I know we have that anyway. Even with these mechanisms, it would be worse. These two mechanisms need to work together. Where does popular representation actually operate in the federal government? Of the three branches, only one, Congress, carries that burden. The people speaks through Congress, not through the Supreme Court, and not through the presidency, despite our massive collective hysteria about presidential elections. Elected only by a portion of the people, any president may choose to try to speak for the whole people, but nothing makes that structurally necessary. Whether the president chooses to try to represent all of us is only ever a matter of the president's character, of whether the president is moved by the better angels of his or her nature. Only Congress carries forward, as a matter of structural necessity, the voices of all the people, those in an electoral minority and in the power-wielding electoral majority. Congress's job is to synthesize those voices. A key way in which Congress's primacy was clear in the Constitution but has eroded over time and become less visible is in the assignment to Congress of the constitutional responsibility to declare war. Over the course of the evolution of our Constitution, the president's authority to use unilateral force outside our borders has increased considerably, expanding from a basis in the need to repel sudden attacks in the language of 1789, to the view now that the president can use limited force around the globe when there is a national interest in regional stability or UN credibility, or to avert humanitarian catastrophe. Nonetheless, the fact that Congress has allowed its powers for declaring war and for other features of direction setting to go into abeyance does not mean that it needs to rest content with that contemporary status quo. It has the power to set strategic direction for the country. Rather than looking to the president to do that, we might look to Congress to do that work. While the president has the responsibility for executing a war as commander-in-chief and for executing a national pandemic strategy, the president shares power with Congress in setting a pandemic strategy. Congress's authority to declare war and in that regard to establish overarching strategic objectives for the nation, even with regard to matters of national security, underscores the scope of Congress's powers also in the context of a pandemic. Here too, Congress can and should assert its powers as the first branch to establish overarching strategic objectives and to appropriate funds in support of them, assigning to the president the execution of Congress's strategy. Those three features of federalism, tiered authorities, a goal of harmonization, and the primacy of the legislature are gifts from the founding era to our era that do provide us with resources to address this pandemic. 20th century renovations to federalism gifted us with two more features: the role of the US government in guaranteeing equal protection of the laws for all, and devolution of power. So let me speak to each of those features for a moment. Madison's enumerations of the key responsibilities and authorities of the federal government included restraint of the states from certain injurious acts. This element of federal authority was formalized in the Constitution, among other ways in Article 4, which declared, "The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government." While crafted as a guarantee to states of protection from destabilization, this provision is also an effective guarantee to citizens of the right to participate in free and equal self-government. The issue of enslavement and the question of how voting rights were determined or withheld meant that in the late 18th and first half of the 19th century, the Constitution did not in fact restrain states from acts that we would now clearly consider injurious. Indeed, the role of the federal government in restraining the states from certain injurious acts did not begin to come into full view until the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in the wake of the Civil War. That part of the federal role was further extended with the dismantling of the segregationist regime established in the wake of the 1876 Hayes-Tilden Agreement. Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 and the 1964 Civil Rights Act, among other acts of jurisprudence and legislation, gave fuller definition to the 14th Amendment requirement that the federal government guarantee equal protection of the laws to all, including providing protection of constitutional rights against infringement by states. In other words, the jurisprudence flowing from the 14th Amendment has established the federal government as a bulwark of civil rights and civil liberties against state actions that might undermine them. Consequently, state governments now exercise their powers and authorities very much constrained by the requirement to deliver equal protection of the laws in relation to all the rights encoded in the Constitution. As legal scholar Heather Gerken points out, ours is not your father's federalism. Today's federalism is sheared of sovereignty. States cannot shield their discrimination from national norms as they did during the days of Jim Crow. If the national government wants to enforce equality norms, it can, provided it's willing to spend the political capital to do so. This feature of our federal system, interestingly, means that all state policies must be designed in relation to requirements of the Equal Protection Clause. This makes state-level policymaking a valuable asset for experimenting with policy decisions to find those that best align with protection of civil rights and civil liberties. Gerken also highlights another feature of modernized federalism, the fifth feature I've wanted to talk about, namely the fact that the plethora of jurisdictions throughout the country can be a resource for empowerment and equality. People who are members of minority populations within a national population can nonetheless exercise majoritarian power within more local jurisdictions, acquiring autonomy and deploying power to shape policies in ways that maximally recognize the distinctive features of their experience and perspective. As Gerken points out, this flexibility to federalism and its provision of opportunities for empowerment provides an additional route to justice. Policy can be adjusted to place and context by local decision-making and thereby more fully empower a diverse population in equitable ways. In such a policymaking context, local decision makers can be given design principles and then asked to deliver the version of a policy for their context that best meets the objectives of these design principles. So where do these five features of federalism, tiered authorities, responsibility to maintain harmony among the states, primacy of the legislative branch, equal protection and devolution, where do these five features leave us now in the context of pandemic response? Recent Supreme Court jurisprudence has imposed limits on the ability of the federal government to compel the states to act. Court, for instance, has prohibited commandeering, whereby the federal government compels state officials to act. The court has also limited the federal government's ability to condition federal funding on state action. The federal government can nonetheless engage state governments in support of a whole government response to an issue. The dominant approach is known as cooperative federalism, in which states are given the opportunity to develop policy in particular areas, for instance, environmental regulation, against a backdrop in which the federal government, in the absence of state action, would itself directly regulate the actions of individuals and civil society organizations. This pathway of cooperative federalism gives states the opportunity to tailor a broad policy framework designed in broad terms by the national government to the specific needs of their state. This is the right approach to federalism for this crisis because it permits quicker, more rapidly scalable action. In addition to providing surge capacity to complement state efforts and coordinating supply chains, the federal government also has the responsibility to define what is a minimum acceptable floor for something like national security health policy. It's the responsibility of the federal government to ensure that the choices made by one state do not threaten public health in another state. To facilitate state autonomy and achieve the benefits of federalism while preserving minimum public health, the federal government should have created or defined a minimally acceptable COVID testing and tracing program to complement state efforts. The virtue of a system with a federally managed minimum, but an emphasis on state leadership whenever possible, is that it allows for the experimentation we value in our federalist system. The federal government could also utilize the federally qualified health centers, which already provide primary care to underserved populations, to provide concrete examples of the floor it sought to establish. Citizens, in other words, should expect the federal government to set goals and targets, to identify best practices for public health, and also to establish a floor below which none will fall. They should expect their state, territorial, tribal, county, metropolitan, and municipal governments to develop and share pandemic response implementation plans. Those pandemic implementation plans should include strategies for the management of health care for the ill, provision of support to those ordered into or voluntarily in isolation, and administration of massive scale pandemic testing, tracing, and supported isolation programs, or TTSI programs, as I discussed in my second lecture. At the same time, however, citizens should also expect the federal government to secure the conditions of success for state and local actors. This review of federalism and its 5 features provides us with all the material we need for an ideal sketch of what a well-conceived federalist strategy might look like, might have looked like in face of a pandemic. It should have had these elements. The federal government should provide surge capacity and support of health infrastructure. We got some of that, not everything that we should have gotten, but we got some of that. The federal government should have established a pandemic testing supply board modeled on the War Production Board to organize the testing supply chain. That did not occur. Federal government should have provided consistent and reliable scientific and policy guidance to states from the Department of Health and Human Services and CDC, supported by the National Academy of Sciences. Again, didn't quite get what we needed on that dimension. The government should conduct national disease surveillance for monitoring disease outbreaks and trajectories. I think they're trying on that point. The federal government needs to maintain liquidity and fiscal viability in the system as a whole. Again, there's an effort underway. And the federal government should maintain safety net testing and contact tracing programs in communities that are not being effectively served by their state, tribal, and local governments. There we've seen very little in the way of clear action. State governments should activate state and national public health infrastructure surge capacity, establish design principles for county and municipal level social distancing programs and full pandemic testing and tracing programs, backstop access to personnel and supply resources for counties and municipalities and tribal governments to administer testing and tracing programs to target levels. That one's very much a work in progress as we now speak. I think many states are trying to do this, and it remains to be seen how well they succeed. State governments need to work to coordinate efforts among counties, municipalities, and tribal governments, and coordinate with neighboring states, especially when it's common for individuals to live in one state but work in another, and provide universal free access to testing and subsequently necessary medical treatment for COVID-positive individuals without insurance. Also, a lot of confusion around that last point. We don't have clear policy at the moment on that point. What about the local level? Tribal authorities and county, metropolitan, municipal, and regional authorities should deploy that public health surge capacity to support the ill and provide support to the isolated. They should design and administer those testing and tracing programs in accordance with the standards set by the state that embed equal protection, non-discrimination, protection of civil liberties. And they need to record pandemic relevant data upward to state and national public health laboratories. Local leaders are trying to do all of these things. I've seen it in all kinds of cases around the country, and they need and seek the support described as the role of the federal and state government. Federalism, in other words, is not, as is commonly understood, simply about handing over responsibility to the states. It's instead about activating each level of our federal system for fulfillment of its proper roles and responsibilities. Here it's worth pausing on what the word federal actually means. It comes, of course, from the Latin word foedus, meaning treaty or compact. And foedus itself comes from fides, meaning trust or faith. The federal compact is about the ties of binding parts to one another, not about their separation from each other. In the context of US federalism, the national government has the job of activating the ties that bind 50 states and 6 territories in support of a coordinated, harmonized, but tiered national strategy. This has not occurred. What can tie the levels of our federal system together? A common purpose. At the most basic level, the question of whether our response to COVID-19 should be a strategy of therapy for the ill, mitigation of the disease, or full suppression has never been resolved. Which of these is the best path for the economy? As I laid out in my second lecture, it's the third. That's the only path that can open the economy safely and keep it open continuously. It's the path that saves the most lives, it protects liberties, and in dollar terms, it's actually the least costly and most supportive of economic recovery. In other words, a purpose should have been easy to find, yet we still seem to be in search of it. This returns me to the subject of my first lecture, governance. A sixth feature of federalism that is central to its success is governance, the setting of a national strategy that successfully activates a healthy social contract and that it is accompanied by public education about that strategy. In the absence of governance at the federal tier of our government, we have not a fully formed federalist strategy, but rather chaos. It's very hard to tell what is actually happening in each of the 50 states and territories. That non-transparency about what's actually unfolding in each place is not a sign of successful federalism, but rather an indication that we have failed to deploy our federalist structure as the asset it should be. We have failed to deploy it for a harmonized, coordinated, but also modularized and flexible activation of a national strategy. What makes federalism federalism and not chaos is the tie that binds. The national government has the responsibility for forming that tie. Conventionally, for the past century, the president has borne the responsibility for binding our federal structure with national strategy. This White House is not achieving that. Congress, though, as the first branch, also bears this responsibility, and we should call their attention to that fact. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle, so much for that thought-provoking talk. And actually, we do have questions. I think I'll go through the ones that have come in so far. And I think the first one is a question about the tiered system. On the one hand, it seems to be a good structure. On the other hand, as you argued, it isn't working now. And the question is really, how do you think a tiered system, when it's not working as well as you would like it to, gets corrected?
Well, I think that's partly why I'm giving this talk, because I think the benefit of a democracy and democratic system of governance is that civil society is also a real part of the structure. And I think that it's the responsibility of individuals and organizations in a civil society context to understand that tiered structure and to be able to advocate on behalf of its well-functioning. So I do think that there are a lot of good efforts actually out there to make things work effectively. So we can point to governors, we can point to the way in which sets of states have formed regional compacts and coordinating bodies to move work forward. I think there's still a distance to travel to achieve an improved activation of our tiered structure. But I think for me, one of the things that's critical to achieving that is actually just building knowledge about how it's supposed to work. I think our knowledge about the best virtues of our tiered system has atrophied, and that the atrophy of our understanding for how it can and should work together is a part of the source of our difficulties.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I mean, I was struck just by that graph you showed in your talk about 26% of the population understands that there are 3 branches of government. I mean, it seems like that's a sobering fact in terms of the kinds of education you want to, you think is necessary.
Just to say, for the last 50 years, we have been investing substantially in STEM education. I think I've talked about this at the last lecture as well, and disinvesting in civic education. I actually gave the wrong statistic. I think I had said last lecture that we invest $15 a year for every student for STEM and something like 13 cents for civics. It's actually $150 per year for every student for STEM versus the 13 cents for civics. And so, you know, I think we are reaping the consequences, or we're seeing the results of how our investment has been patterned.
Thank you. There's another question, which is, do you think that the current crisis caused by coronavirus requires a reframing of the balance between public good and individual liberties?
So that's a deep and important question. I don't actually think it requires a reframing. I think that the goal of securing a constitutional democracy in the face of the existential threat that a pandemic is to secure that society as a constitutional democracy. In other words, the project of the public good is one that fully incorporates the basic liberties. So I don't think we actually need a rethinking of those objectives and how to integrate the idea of the public good and basic liberties. I think it's rather that we have to figure out how to connect that overarching objective to policy decisions. So that's where I see the disconnection, not in how we think about the public good, how we think about liberties, but how we actually take those commitments and put them at the center of policy deliberation.
Thank you. And another question that's come in is, do you think there's a right to public health and or an adequate minimal income for public health in this pandemic period?
So I do think there's a right to health. I think there's a right to the foundation for health is actually typically how I would put it. Right to access to the foundations for health. At the end of the day, I think, you know, one can't obviously legislate for, fully protect people against choices they make that will be detrimental to their own health, but that everybody should have access to a foundation for health, I do take to be a right. And there, I think we have an important national conversation to have. I always like to point out the fact that in the Declaration of Independence, when we have that sort of all-important second sentence about self-evident truths, and we're introduced to the concept of inalienable rights, we're introduced to a set of examples, not a complete list, right? So the sentence says, all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So in other words, we are given 3 examples of what belongs on the list of rights, not an exhaustive list. And I have always read that sentence, therefore, as a charge to every generation to think through the question of what belongs on that list of rights. And I do think a foundation for health belongs on that list of rights for our generation. And I think that is a different thing in kind from in previous generations or a century ago or something like that, because of the nature and structure of health infrastructure and health resources. They are a category of resource that now is best provisioned through public good mechanisms. And so I think we have to recognize that. Now, to say all of that is not to answer decisively a question of, you know, should there be private insurance, should everything be public, et cetera, et cetera. I think that there are hybrid systems that can deliver a foundation of health for all. But I do, yes, think that a foundation of health is a right.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, just to follow on with that, the question and your response, I mean, you said, I mean, you said that the pursuit of happiness is something to sort of be rethought in every generation. I think that's I agree, I think it's a great idea. The question I have, I suppose, following up on the person's question is, how does one do that? I mean, what constitutes a real conversation about what the pursuit of happiness consists in?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think there are a number of ways we do that. I mean, I think partly we do that through debates about specific pieces of legislation. We can also do that through constitutional amendments. So this is not in the space of health, but for example, I think there are people working on a constitutional amendment around campaign finance. I think that is a good idea. It's sort of a way of responding to Citizens United, a sort of basic picture of what does it mean for a citizenry to be empowered in relationship to financial power in a democracy. And so when we have the opportunity for public conversations around pivotal choices like that, I think those are occasions for thinking about the pursuit of happiness. I also think it's really important to recognize that we have state constitutions as well as the federal constitution. We don't pay enough attention to our rights as they are articulated in state constitutions. So for example, there's no right to education in the federal constitution, but there is a right to education in almost every single state constitution. And so we have this unusual structure in the US where the category of things identified as social rights are very often attached to state constitutions rather than the federal constitution. And that reflects the same sort of tiered structure I was talking about. So education, health, these are things that have been historically thought to be operative primarily at the state level. So I think an important question is, where should state constitutions be activated as well in support of things that we would now recognize as rights, not only education, but also health. And then there's a conversation to be had about, well, what are the moments when something that has been at the state level, we need to recognize as having transitioned to being properly a federal right or federal concern. And so I think the pandemic raises that question because this is a case where questions of health really are national. You can't separate out what's happening in one state from what's happening in the rest of the country. And they are very closely connected to sort of a broad conception of national security. And indeed, sort of national security sort of work at the federal level has incorporated health questions over the course of the last decade and a half. So I think calling attention to that conversation and thinking about what does it mean for the health infrastructure of the country is a way to get at that question of how we think about health and happiness for our society. So, I mean, I take your point, Jonathan, you're asking a big kind of hard philosophical question about how as a society do we ask the hardest questions? And I'm going back and telling you, well, we can do it through the nuts and bolts of policy. I think we can. I just think it's really important that when we have the nuts and bolts policy conversations, we actually take the time to ask ourselves what values are at stake here? What are our overarching objectives? How do we want to define those overarching objectives? And that's what I feel like does not happen enough. We don't have enough comfort kind of pivoting from the nuts and bolts of policy to the question of the larger value at stake in a particular policy choice.
Thank you. Another question has come in, which is, how could federalism play a part in educating citizens that masks, distancing, and isolation constitute participation in the protection of the public or to the public?
So that's a great question. That's a great question. And the question is right in the sense that it points out that the element of governance that I pointed to, that I described as public education, is itself complicated in a federalist context, right? So if you have a kind of successful work or body of public education happening coming out of the White House, that takes a burden away from governors, for example. But in the absence of that, then you have sort of 50 different sort of platforms of public education and a lot of inconsistency and conflict and so forth. It's much harder to develop and build a kind of coherent public conversation. So I think, again, just to give you a kind of personal, practical answer, which is that, as you know from these lectures, I've been spending a fair amount of time kind of working on policy development. And it has become very clear to me that one of the challenges the country is experiencing is that the sort of different civil society organizations producing policy and recommendations aren't fully aligned with each other. So people are hearing, 10 different messages about what the right policy pathway is. The truth of the matter is that the bodies that are producing these recommendations are actually very close to each other, very closely aligned. And so I've started reaching out and saying, like, hey, folks, it's time to kind of get on the same page with messages because we're actually making the problem worse. There are sort of places where we're used to a kind of notion of a kind of competition of ideas if you come out of the academy, coming out of think tanks. But we're in the kind of moment where we have to see the value in coordination and cooperation rather than in competition. So I think, civil society recognition of the need for coordination is a starting point for the answer to your question. And to the degree that governors can coordinate with other governors and begin to develop shared messages and shared approaches, we help ourselves.
Thank you. Two questions have come in that are actually either side of it seems like a single question, but two sides. Each question poses a different side of a similar question. Let's put it that way. So the first one, and I'd like to ask them together. so you could address them both. So the first one is, where do you see true federalism coming closest to fruition in action against this pandemic? And then the second question is sort of the opposite sort of side or emphasis, which is, entire countries had to shut down completely to cope with the infection. Why do you believe a federalist approach may be an option for the US?
Okay, great, thank you. So Germany would be the place that gets credit for making federalism work. And just to give you an example, so when the pandemic hit in Germany, one of the first things the national government did was direct resources to local health authorities so that they could upgrade their IT systems so that the entire country could function with a shared IT system for tracking the disease, managing, testing, etc. So they very much relied on state level, local level decision making, but they equipped everybody with the same tools, same vocabulary, the same framework so that they could be part of the same conversation. So I think that is actually an excellent model of success. In this country, I mean, we are a big, geographically dispersed and geographically fragmented country with very different kinds of population centers. So, there are high density places, there are low density places, and it was really the case that until quite recently, there were parts of the country that had almost no virus presence, and they really should have been under different policy regimes. So the challenge in this country is that we don't have either the sort of habits of mind, normative structures, ethical structures for thinking about internal travel or the potential of internal travel restrictions, nor do we have legal structures for that. And so it is harder for us to have different parts of the country have different policy regimes because of that fact and expectation of internal travel. And so I think to succeed in sort of segmenting different parts of the population, we actually have to work through that problem. It's happening in a kind of de facto way as states establish advisories around quarantine. So for example, in Massachusetts, if you arrive in Massachusetts right now, the expectation is that you have to quarantine for 14 days before you do anything else. I don't think there's any enforcement of that. It's a purely advisory structure. So the degree of its efficacy is, I'm sure, very much open to question. But that's the kind of question we actually have to engage in. That comes along with the sort of benefits of flexibility for different parts of the country.
Just let me follow up on that. Is much known about what the actual travel habits are in terms of especially people from high density and corona affected areas moving over to low population states that are not very densely populated and not very troubled with the coronavirus? I mean, is there do we know what kind of a threat is being posed by the issue of travel?
Right, we do to some extent. I mean, so for example, we know, I mean, this is a sad thing to say, but we know that most of the country had its sort of COVID introduction from travel from New York, for example.
Yeah.
So it's a real issue. And that's what, I mean, with regard to the sort of nuts and bolts of policy, I mean, I think the challenge is that you want to do two things simultaneously. I mean, we really do want an aggressive surge of suppression of the virus, right? In some sense, that's another reason this federal country needs to suppress the virus and not just mitigate it, because it's only actually if we suppress it comprehensively throughout the entire country that we don't have the problem of routine reintroduction from one part of the country to the next. So I think, in fact, the federalism and our open internal borders put an even greater emphasis on the need to actually be quite ambitious about suppressing the virus and not merely mitigating its presence.
Danielle, just thank you so much for such a wonderful lecture and set of discussions over these last week. And this was really very thought-provoking. And I'd just like to say, in addition to thank you to the audience, please join us again tomorrow night at 6 p.m. when Professor Danielle Allen will give her last Berlin family lecture on the subject, A Transformed Peace. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you all.
Lovely to see you.
Likewise. Take good care.